It's being called Bloody Sunday. 9 people are killed in raids against suspected communist rebels in the Philippines. But the UN says the dead are human rights activists. So, can anything be done to stop the escalating violence? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Mohammed Jamjoom. Police and the army in the Philippines are being accused of killing human rights activists under the guise of combating alleged communist rebels. The latest deadly incident has been labeled Bloody Sunday. On March 7th, 9 people were shot dead when police and the military raided offices and homes south of Manila. They say they found weapons and those they killed had resisted arrest. But rights groups say the victims were community organizers, not fighters. The government insists the operation was lawful. 2 days earlier, President Rodrigo Duterte urged security forces to kill alleged rebels and ignore human rights.
I told the military and police that during encounters, if the enemy is holding a gun, kill them. Kill them right away. Ignore human rights. That is my order. I'll be the one to go to jail, no problem.
The UN is accusing Duterte of fanning violence and intimidation of rights defenders.
There is a history of human rights advocates being red tagged or being accused of being fronts for the armed wing of the Communist Party in the Philippines. In our June 2020 report, the High Commissioner warned that such public labeling has proved extremely dangerous, and she urged the protection of human rights defenders, journalists, and others at risk. In recent months, there have been dozens of other activists and several journalists arrested, including on Human Rights Day on the 10th of December 2020.
Lawyers have also been targeted by the so-called red tags. At least 54 have been killed since Rodrigo Duterte took office in 2016. Some had been representing indigenous farmers who were accused of having links with communist rebels. Government data shows only 5 of the killings have reached court.
Lawyers who took up the lonely path, if I may call it, dangerous path of serving those who are in danger, who are voiceless, who what the church would call the lost, the least, and the last in our society. There are very few. And then if you attack this very few, what would that leave us? Who will defend these defenseless people?
All right, let's bring in our guests in Manila. Carlos Conde, Philippines researcher at Human Rights Watch. In Dubai, Richard Haydarian, academic and author of The Rise of Duterte, a Populist Revolt Against Elite Democracy. And also in Manila, Lian Buan, justice reporter for Rappler. Lian has covered government corruption and the culture of impunity in the Philippines. A warm welcome to you all. Carlos, Human Rights Watch says the Bloody Sunday raids highlight the need for United Nations member countries to address the worsening human rights crisis situation in the Philippines. What actions would Human Rights Watch like to see the UN take?
Well, for one, we want the UN to really, specifically the UN Human Rights Council, to take a more robust and more, definitive action in the Philippines, quite apart from what they did in October 2020 when they passed this resolution granting technical assistance to the country. We definitely want more than just technical assistance. We want the Human Rights Council to launch an independent international investigation into the killings in the Philippines, not just against the activists, but also against drug suspects, which has been going on since 2016.
Lian, there's a report in Rappler dated March 11th that police and military in Antipolo, Rizal have prevented the families of 4 activists killed in the Bloody Sunday operations from claiming their bodies. What's the justification for that? Why would the government be doing that?
It's not the first time that it happened. When a prominent activist, Randall Ichanis, died also in last year. The same thing happened with the police and the military. The justification is that they claim that the police has custody of the bodies because these people died in operation. But of course, human rights lawyers will tell you that the police has no right to take custody of the bodies and that families will always have the right to these bodies.
Richard, President Duterte had told police earlier this month that if they have an encounter with armed communist rebels and if security forces saw that those rebels were armed, to go ahead and kill them, don't mind human rights. How worrying is that to hear from the president of the Philippines?
Well, as worrying as that is, it's also reversion to a mean or reversion to a type. President Duterte won the 2016 elections, at least that's his understanding, on an anti-crime, anti-drug agenda. And over the past year, the Philippine government has been bogged down with dealing with the pandemic. So some people have raised concerns on whether there's going to be a different direction in terms of the war on drugs. Some of the supporters of the president perhaps are saying whether the president is still committed to war on drugs. So this is a way for the president to say that he's not letting go, that there's no loosening of the grip in terms of the war on drugs, and that he's going to continue until his final months in office as he enters his twilight year in office. At the same time, we see that top officials like the Justice Minister, Mr. Guevara, in a recent address to the UNHCR, United Nations Human Rights Council, suggesting that the government is trying to get its act together and is trying to launch investigations. And they revealed that there were miscarriage of due process in perhaps half of the operations conducted by the government. So we see this bifurcation in the strategy of the government, the president signaling continuity, that is committed to maintain the war on drugs on its course, while top officials within the government, in the justice ministries, are trying to signal to the world that they're trying to get their act together and to clean this up. So we see this bifurcation, which just shows the sensitive political situation that Duterte is entering in his final months in office.
Leanne, it looked to me like you were reacting to some of what Richard was saying there. Did you want to jump in?
First of all, I just wanted to add also to what you asked before, why the police would want to take custody of the bodies. The families would say that it's because they wouldn't want an independent autopsy to be conducted on these bodies. And that's why the families really fought to get the bodies of the activists who died last Sunday, and they've been able to get that to the hospital for an independent autopsy, because an independent autopsy would reveal whether brute force has been applied, if excessive force has been applied, and whether how many bullets were pumped to the bodies of these activists, if it were true that they really resisted arrest from the policemen.
Carlos, Human Rights Watch also says that victims in many raids that have happened in the Philippines belonged to groups that the government had earlier red tagged. I want to ask you specifically about red tagging. Could you explain to our viewers what it means for those who are labeled with it?
But before I answer that, Mohammed, let me just add a little bit to what Leanne had said about
Go ahead.
The bodies that were in Antipolo and in many other cases. So what's happening here, I think, is that there's a legitimate fear among many Filipinos that because the police is doing this, a cover-up is imminent, or what they're doing is a cover-up. Because why would you want to hold on to the bodies? Why wouldn't they want families to go retrieve the bodies? So there's a fear here, a real fear, that something's going on in terms of covering up what happened during those raids. So having said that, the issue of red tagging, this has been going on for decades in the Philippines. This is not something new, but this has ramped up under this administration. And this is really scary because in the Philippines, being red tagged, being called a communist, and now being called a communist and also a terrorist at the same time, is practically a death sentence for people who are being red tagged. So this is quite serious, and this is one of the government's ways to try to intimidate, discourage people from speaking out, from joining activist groups, and even the government thinks that by vilifying these groups, these activists, they are going to stem the tide, or to discourage people from joining the communist insurgency. But the impact of this on civil society is quite massive. This is obviously restricting democratic space in the Philippines and sending some chilling effect on a lot of people.
Richard, I saw you nodding to some of what Carlos was saying there. Did you have something you wanted to add?
Well, I mean, on one hand, this is classic populism. One thing that is common among right-wing populists is that they claim monopoly on representation of the people's will. So anyone who's not with them or doesn't 100% agree with their point of view is automatically the enemy of the people. So given that amorphous definition of who are the people, and effectively everyone else is not with the people, the definition can expand. So it first started with criminals and drug peddlers, then it became so-called oligarchs, and then liberal media, so-called yellows in the Philippines, and now they're going after the reds. And in fact, since the Marcos dictatorship, the conspiracy of the right always has been that the red, meaning the communists and the leftists, will team up with the yellows, meaning the liberals, to bring down the government. And that kind of conspiracy theory has been going on for quite some time. At the same time, there's also a second element to this. Under President Duterte, the military establishment has gained tremendous amount of influence. President Duterte couldn't get rid of our alliance with the United States. But if there's one thing with hawkish elements within the military, is their hatred of the communist movement. So it's also possible that this is not only about Duterte, but also some hawkish element within the military trying to make the most out of Dutertismo or Duterte's era to also strike against their age-old enemy, which is the communist or progressive movement. Again, the problem here is that the definition of who is red, who is communist, who's rebellious, is increasingly also amorphous, and increasingly even universities in the countries are being targeted, including the University of the Philippines, the hotbed of activism in the Philippines for the past half century.
Leanne, from your perspective, are you concerned that the escalation in violence will only get worse? And also, what do you think, are there concrete steps that can be taken to lessen the violence?
On your first question, last year, we were already saying that if the United Nations Human Rights Council does not take a stronger resolution on the killings, that more people would die. And we saw that 9 people died in Sunday. So I don't think that it's a matter of us being concerned that more people would die. It's a matter of evidence that more people have indeed died since last year, when all these groups have been calling for stronger resolutions, not just from the United Nations Human Rights Council, but from our own government departments. The killings of lawyers have started to rise as early as September, October last year, but there was no action from the Department of Justice or the Supreme Court. It was only in January that they started to hold meetings with the lawyers, and even then, lawyers still died after those meetings. And we just found out that 2 days ago, the Supreme Court's Office of the Court Administrator has asked judges to do an inventory of the cases about the lawyers who have died or who have been attacked. And we're wondering why it has taken them only this March to issue such an order when the meetings have started in January. And even beyond that, why the action only now when lawyers were already being killed, not just last year, but years before that?
Carlos, you heard Leanne there talk about the fact that it's not just activists who are being targeted in the Philippines right now, it's also members of the legal profession. I want to ask you specifically about that. How bad has it gotten right now when it comes to targeting members of the legal profession and attacks against them?
Oh, it's gotten really so bad, Muhammad, and it's something that keeps us awake these days in the Philippines. I mean, one of the latest attacks that happened was last week when a lawyer in the central Philippines was stabbed with a screwdriver. Clearly, evidently, some people went after him for what he was doing as a lawyer for the National Union of People's Lawyer, which is a group of lawyers that are representing marginalized sectors in the Philippines. And just today, there was a disclosure that the provincial police in a province in the central Philippines actually asked a court there to release to them the names of lawyers who may be representing who are representing what they call communist terrorist groups, which is, of course, what they mean are activist people or activist groups. So this is, as I said, this is a veritable hit list if the court grants the police this list of lawyers that are representing people from the activist sector. So, it's really bad. And the police right now, they're going after not just the activists, but also those who are defending them. There has been an increase, and Leanne can speak more of this perhaps. There has been an increase of the number of lawyers who are being attacked in the Philippines, and more than half of these attacks are work-related. So, from all angles, you have human rights defenders being attacked, you have journalists being attacked, civil society leaders, civil society activists being attacked, and now even those who help them, who represent them legally, are also under threat, are also under attack. So all the institutions now in the Philippines, for civil society to flourish are being undermined and being intimidated.
Richard, you mentioned a few moments ago that President Duterte was in a bit of a politically sensitive situation. I want to ask you about the fact that last December, the International Criminal Court released a preliminary report saying that there was evidence to show crimes against humanity had been committed in the Philippines under President Duterte. Is this something that is of great concern to Duterte?
Absolutely. I mean, it's a convergence of many factors. I mean, on one hand, the ICC investigations are increasingly moving towards a potential prosecution or at least formal investigation against top officials in the Philippines. That's not necessarily good news if you're entering the end of your term. At the same time, you have a Democratic majority in the U.S. Congress, and we saw that actually back in 2019. Top U.S. senators, especially Democratic senators, were agitating for tougher sanctions. Some lieutenants of the president faced travel restrictions. In fact, that was one of the reasons why President Duterte threatened to abrogate a major defense agreement with the United States. Now, Biden himself may be pragmatic, but there are, of course, more overzealous elements in the Democratic Party who may push for even tougher sanctions as President Duterte enters his final months in office. So in multiple directions, President Duterte is facing, at least whether in perception or reality, these kinds of threats, the potential for international intervention of one kind or the other. Now, at the same time, you have the European Union with the new ambassador trying to strike a more pragmatic kind of position and try to find an understanding, because the understanding of some people is that they also do not want to push President Duterte to a corner because that might force him to resort to extraordinary measures. Let's not forget that even though President Duterte cannot run for office next year, technically, if everything goes according to the Constitution, his daughter can run. He can run as the vice president. There are still emergency powers in place. His allies are in very dominant position. He has a grip on local politics. So if Duterte is threatened, he might be tempted to stay in power in one way or another, maybe not as president, but as a vice president or as a power behind the throne. And that could complicate the situation. So on the other hand, you have European Union or other elements, maybe there's thinking that a better approach is not to push Duterte to a corner, but play the long game and rather invest in capacity building in the Philippine institutions. In fact, I think that's the context within which you have to understand the emphasis of the Justice Minister in the Philippines on technical assistance, on institution building. So these are the political dilemmas we are facing as we enter the twilight months of President Duterte's term in office. I mean, the reality in the Philippines is that there's no such thing as rule of law. It's rule by law. That means politics will shape how law is implemented and how law is expressed in everyday reality. And the paradox of Duterte's presidency is that it promised law and order, but now we're seeing more generalized anarchy. And in some ways, that strengthens Duterte's hand because people will need even more strongman leadership or in a climate of fear. So that's why we're in a very delicate political situation, and that has implications for accountability and justice questions.
Leanne, in his previous answer, Carlos mentioned how journalists in the Philippines have been targeted increasingly. We all know, of course, that your organization, Rappler, and Maria Ressa have been targeted. I want to ask you specifically how bad the situation is in the Philippines right now for members of your profession.
There's basically, I can answer it with one phrase. It's really chilling effect. It's the threat that if you are critical, you might be sued for libel, you might be harassed online, called names, or worse, you can get attacked or you can get killed. In the daily dilemma of the job, it's as simple as refusing access to you. It's as simple as government officials not answering your question. It's as simple as them trying to block the story you're going to publish. So it's a chilling effect. It's that thought in your head that whatever I write next may lose me my next story or may even cost me my life. But then again, I would like to believe that the Philippine media as a whole is pushing back and are continuing to do their jobs. Never mind the threats that happened to our colleague IC Salem, who was jailed for 3 months, and even after she was cleared, she had to stay a week or a month, 2 weeks in jail before she had to be freed. So those are the kinds of risks that we run into for doing our jobs here.
Carlos, it looked to me like you had something to say. Please go ahead.
Yeah, I want to pick up on what Richard said about the international response to what's happening here. I think, to be honest about our assessment of the international response to the crisis here has been quite disappointing for a lot, not just us, but a lot of human rights defenders who are monitoring this catastrophe that we're facing. I mean, that Human Rights Council resolution, as Agnes Calamar said, is a shameful resolution. Many among us were distressed by that because the HRC, we feel, bought into the agenda of the Philippine government. And keep in mind, the Philippine government has been launching a massive disinformation campaign about what's happening in the Philippines, promising all sorts of things because promising the things that they think the international community would want to hear. And then you have also other countries, foreign governments, they have been dragging their foot about what's happening in the Philippines. I mean, there are mechanisms that they can use to try to hold this government to account, but they have not been using that, and that is quite a disappointment. Now we realize that there are considerations to be made because you're dealing with a fellow government, but the situation here in the Philippines, and this is not just after Duterte happened, but for decades now, the killings, extrajudicial killings. I mean, to put it bluntly, how many more dead bodies are they willing to wait to see before they act? Before these countries, the European Union, the United States, Canada, Australia, they have human rights commitments, not just at the HRC, but also to the Philippines. We have not been seeing any of these commitments being held up by these countries. And in the meantime, thousands of people are being killed. When are they going to act? That's my question.
Leanne, I saw you nodding your head a lot to what Carlos was saying. Did you want to jump in?
Yeah, just picking up on what Carlos said, what we've done really in Rappler is to monitor what the Philippine local system has done to address these killings, because the rationale basically of the quote-unquote shameful resolution of the United Human Rights Council is that it was acknowledging that the Philippine domestic system was doing something to address these killings. So we have been monitoring that. So I'll tell the story for the Supreme Court, for example. As Carlos said earlier, there was a request from the local police from the court to give them a copy of the lawyers who are representing alleged communists. Lawyers have said this is like a kill list, comparable to the drug list that was the basis of the policemen in their bloody anti-drug campaign. And of course, it's bad that it has to happen to anyone, but that it's happening to lawyers is even worse. And I saw a comment from a prominent lawyer also here that they're demanding the Supreme Court to say something and publicly denounce that policemen are resorting to these kinds of actions. Well, of course, Supreme Courts or courts all over the world are passive institutions. They're not active. They will not be the one to speak out. They will not be the one to speak out first. But lawyers are just saying that these are now lawyers under threat. They fall exactly within your jurisdiction. And to note that the former Chief Justice Maria Lourdes Sereno did this during her term. She publicly stood for the judges who were included in President Duterte's narco list, and she said, we have to protect these judges we have to give them due process. And what happened to Chief Justice Sereno? She was ousted. She's no longer in position. And when it comes to the Department of Justice, which is the executive agency, their efforts, their programs were the ones mainly cited by the Human Rights Council for issuing that soft resolution and technical assistance. And we've monitored all these projects. And I'm just going to state fact. The Drug War Review Panel was created in June 2020, when as early as 2018, they already knew that people were dying in police operations. And the technical assistance by the United Nations has not even officially begun. The Justice Secretary confirmed that to me yesterday. He said they're still waiting for a document to be signed before the technical assistance kicks in.
All right, we've run out of time, so we're going to have to leave the conversation there. Thank you so much to all of our guests, Carlos Conde, Richard Heydarian, and Leanne Buan. And thank you, too, for watching. You can see this and all our previous episodes again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Mohammed Jamjoom, and the whole team here, bye for now.